Live to the statements of the President of Bolivia, Luis Arce.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Luis Alberto Arce Catacora, Constitutional President of the Plurinational State of Bolivia, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, fellow President of the General Assembly of the United Nations, Abdullah Shahid, Brother Secretary General Antonio Guterres, fellow heads of state and government, ministers of foreign affairs, and delegates present in the room. First of all, allow me to hail your election as President of this Assembly, as well as I would like to congratulate the Secretary General on being re-elected for a second term. We find ourselves in the most important forum created by humankind following the Second World War. It was designed as a forum to debate, to reflect, and to seek effective solutions to the various crises that our planet is confronting. The United Nations organization was designed based on the principle of legal equality of states, and to which can be added political equality. It was created to avoid having our planet once again experience armed clashes among states that endanger world peace that we all aspire to. Now, these goals have not been fully met because the ambition to control access to natural resources and to dominate entire nations have continued to lead to direct armed invasions, criminal blockades, and indirect interventions in the military, political, economic, and even the media spheres. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated how fragile our societies and states are. It has created unprecedented negative impacts in such areas as healthcare, the economy, education, among other areas. It has put at risk the achievement of the goals of the 2030 Agenda within the established timetable. Now, in addition to the multidimensional crisis of capitalism, the economic crisis, social, environmental, food, and energetic crisis, we can now add a sanitary crisis. At the same time, this crisis has clearly illustrated that inequality between the main capitalist countries and those on the periphery continues. Euphemistically, these two groups are denominated developed and developing countries. The growth in poverty and extreme poverty and the inequitable concentration of vaccines has been condemned by the World Health Organization itself. According to available data, to date, only 30% of the global population that requires vaccines has received at least one dose of an anti-COVID-19 vaccine. And barely 15.5% is fully vaccinated. At the same time, only 1.1% of the population in low-income countries has received at least one dose. Capitalism has transformed all areas of social life into merchandise. And health has not managed to escape its tentacles. Medical science must be at the service of humankind without any kind of geographical, political, social discrimination or discrimination based on nationality. Access to vaccines must be considered as a human right. We cannot remain indifferent, or even less to seek to profit from health at a time of pandemic. We are fully convinced that the pandemic could be overcome with a broader coverage of vaccination. The World Health Organization has determined that when 70% of this goal is reached, 70% of vaccination, we could overcome the pandemic. However, access to vaccines, especially countries on the periphery, is limited. In this context, we believe that it is important, that the following is important. Transnational companies that produce medication should lift their patents and share their knowledge and technology for the production of COVID-19 vaccines. And through our joint efforts, we can ensure immediate access to vaccines to all people in all countries of the world. Second, that supranational organizations such as the United Nations and governments work in solidarity to avoid the hoarding of vaccines and promote the universal, just, equitable, and timely access to vaccines, as well as to medications and medical products in order to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. Current circumstances created by the pandemic are in fact an appeal to solidarity and international cooperation among brethren nations in favor of life. In the fight against COVID-19 around our planet, thousands and thousands of healthcare workers fulfilled their role, and we would like to pay tribute to them, and we would like to express our gratitude to them for their work. In Europe, in spite of its problems, countries managed to reach an agreement and have allocated billions of dollars to reactivate its economy. The United States, similarly, has managed to reach a consensus amongst its politicians to allocate billions towards its economic recovery. However, unfortunately, in Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa, the states and governments do not have organizations that are focused on the fight for life. Quite to the contrary, organizations such as the Organization of American States, OAS, divide us, promote coups d'etats, and generate instability. Fellow President, the COVID-19 crisis has also demonstrated vulnerabilities and inequalities in the financial system and in the global economy. In a closely interconnected world, it is essential to deepen solidarity, complementarity, and to respond to the needs of our peoples in the post-pandemic context. To do this, it's necessary to strengthen integration and cooperation so that we can confront the multidimensional impact on our economies, on our industries, and on our capacity to achieve food security based on our sovereignty. In this context, it is essential to rebuild our economies in order to ensure social protection and health care. In other words, we must safeguard and protect workers, farmers, indigenous peoples, original peoples, micro and small businesses, and entrepreneurs. We should protect them just as we protect banks, large corporations, or transnational corporations. To achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, it is essential that we confront the risks that the pandemic has put before us. Bearing this in mind, we are analyzing and proposing comprehensive solutions to the vulnerability that has been generated by indebtedness in developing countries compared their debt to the main capitalist countries and financial institutions. With this in mind, comprehensive measures are important that international financial organizations could implement based on a sustainable vision and that do not lead to additional burdens or further indebt beneficiary states. States must put priority on eradicating extreme poverty. States should focus on access to basic services for their population. And we must assume in a responsible way the challenge of building a future based on solidarity, complementarity, sustainability, and cooperation among peoples. However, we will not make much progress in diminishing or eliminating these problems, such as poverty, as long as we continue in the current economic global order, which is unjust. Wherever we see injustice, and which continues to prevail in and impose inequality in international trade and puts obstacles towards industrialization. Furthermore, we have to continue to highlight that unfortunately the digital gap persists, and the rapid progress in digital technologies and electronic trade, e-trade, has become an instrument that could help economic recovery. However, the digital divide prevents these benefits from being shared equitably. And when this happens, digital technologies and e-trade become instruments to merely consolidate this unjust global order. Bearing this in mind, the plurinational state of Bolivia is proposing to move forward on reaching agreements with multilateral financial organizations to refinance or to ease the external debt at the global level, and to support social policies for populations in a situation of vulnerability, and to do this based on an approach of sustainable and comprehensive development. By the same token, it's important for the various international financial mechanisms to activate concessional lending, that they design and implement long-term and medium-term measures to ensure the achievement of the 2030 development agenda. Fellow President, our planet, our common home, our Mother Earth, still is suffering the terrible consequences of consumerism and excessive depredation of natural resources. And once again, we believe that the capitalist system is one of the main causes of the climate crisis. Based on the cosmovision of indigenous peoples, there is an interdependence between human beings and nature. This is why, as a state, we are promoting a new model of coexistence for the well-being of our people, which our people call living well. It promotes a change in the approach to life, leaving behind predation, irrational competition, and excessive consumerism, and this insatiable search to accumulate profits at the cost of Mother Earth and the life on our planet. This approach, this cosmovision of our indigenous peoples, is valid for all the peoples of the world, because what capitalism in fact is putting at risk is humanity itself, nature itself. Now, to take the path towards living well implies that our public policies and ways of life be in harmony and in balance with nature. We must restore our relationship with Mother Earth, because what's at stake is our survival as a species. The growing threat represented by non-economic risks for financial and macroeconomic stability. I'm thinking of the climate crisis, obviously. This has demonstrated the need to formulate policies that help in us move towards a new economic model. Now, consistent with our thinking, we have developed a Bolivian vision for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We are proposing that all states parties meet in the framework of the COP26 in Glasgow, work together, and we would like to suggest the following for this based on this. Number one, the only real solution to eliminate the increase in temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius requires distributing the carbon budget among countries based on the criteria of climate justice and based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Number two, the main capitalist countries must assume the climate debt and the historic compensation toward the rest of countries of the world through financial cooperation, the transfer of technologies, and the development of capacities, thus implementing the agreements that have been signed to date. Number three, it's essential to incorporate the knowledge, practices, and experiences of indigenous peoples and nations in building societies and ecosystems that are resilient to climate change. Number four, there's an urgent need to strengthen and step up efforts of countries to fight the climate crisis. In particular, the approaches that are not based on the carbon market. Efforts should be effective in reducing domestic greenhouse gas emissions. We are convinced of the urgent need to reform the global architecture that guides financial, investment, trade, development, environmental, and social policies around the world. Now, in this same context, we welcome the holding of the summit on food systems, because the health and the life of humanity depend on their access to food. We must strengthen and acknowledge the important contribution to the economy and preservation of nature that small-scale farmers and indigenous populations make. By the same token, I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate this Assembly for the very important decision adopted in declaring a decade of indigenous languages, which will begin next year. Languages transmit culture, knowledge, skills, and the history of peoples. This is why it's important for our states throughout in these years and in the future to promote actions to revitalize and strengthen indigenous languages, which are part and parcel of the cultural wealth of humankind. Fellow President, the charter of our organization is the main reference in safeguarding international law that governs relations among our states. For this reason, the United Nations organization has a preeminent role, especially in safeguarding human rights. This is why it is inconceivable that powerful countries take actions and measures that are unilateral and that generate negative effects against the right to life, to health, to food, and to education of millions of people. Just has been stated in this General Assembly in many opportunities, these coercive measures in fact, are applied extraterritorially and unilaterally. This is not only immoral, but in fact goes against international law and contravenes the Charter itself of the United Nations. It weakens multilateralism. These measures are even more to be condemned and rejected when they intentionally and directly affect the exercise and enjoyment of human rights. Human rights are inherent. They're inviolable. They cannot be double standards. Access to vaccines, medicine, medical products, and essential goods such as food cannot be subjected to political interests. Nor should the right to life or the right to health should be used as a political mechanism to put pressure at the expense of the lives of millions of people that depend on this, especially in the time of pandemic. We reject any unilateral measure aimed at preventing our countries from exercising their right to determine freely their political, economic, and social systems. A clear demonstration of the application of unilateral measures is the inhumane and criminal commercial and financial blockade against Cuba, which puts at risk the lives of more than 11 million citizens of this country in the midst of a pandemic. It's a crime against humanity, but at the same time, it is a regrettable example of how the decisions of this assembly are not implemented and complied with by certain countries. It is frustrating to admit that year after year, in spite of the virtually global unanimity in condemning the blockade, those responsible for this crime ignore the clamor of the entire world. Fellow President, before concluding this intervention in the General Assembly, allow me to inform the member states that the plurinational state of Bolivia, following an unfortunate coup d'etat that took place in November of 2019, following that, last October 2020, we restored democracy thanks to the unity, combat, and conscience of the Bolivian people, which was confirmed in elections. And we are recovering our intercultural democracy as well as our political, economic, and social stability, which has cost us a great deal of work to build. The rupture in the constitutional order in my country involved the participation of national actors, politicians that do not have the support of the people in elections, unethical members of the police and the armed forces, civic committees, certain members of the Catholic hierarchy, and of the media. However, it also included the participation of the OAS through its Secretary General Luis Almagro, and also the participation of other governments, such as the former government of Argentina, which sent weapons and munitions to those behind the coup d'etat, and the representatives of the European Union and other international non-governmental organizations. The last report presented by an international group of independent experts identified that in the plurinational state of Bolivia, serious violations of human rights were committed, massacres, and summary executions. Our commitment to the Bolivian people is that we ensure justice for the 38 lives lost, for the hundreds of wounded, detained, for those who were persecuted, who were sent in exile, and for the grave violations of human rights that were conducted during the de facto government. Because justice is an essential precondition of any democracy and for the construction of a true social peace. Unfortunately, the right to the presumption of innocence and due process was systematically violated. Persecution and jailing of innocent people became a daily occurrence and normal occurrence. Humiliation, repression, and the racist and sexist use of force aimed against our population who were mobilized to defend their rights, most of them indigenous peoples, workers, and farmers, was something that occurred daily. Strong and dignified nations will always be built on the basis of the lessons learned from the tragedies that they've experienced, thus collectively building social peace through the process of memory, truth, and justice. And that is the commitment we've made to the Bolivian people. My government, democratically elected, in spite of multiple difficulties, including the COVID-19 pandemic, is making every possible effort to restore stability and economic growth with social justice. With the support of over 55% of the votes of the Bolivian people, we have the responsibility of defending our independence and dignity as a free and sovereign state. The plurinational state of Bolivia states in this global forum states that it has a right to obtain a free and sovereign access to the Pacific Ocean through dialogue and coordination with the Republic of Chile, in accordance with a decision of the International Court of Justice, which in its decision on the 1st of October of 2018 urged Chile and Bolivia to work towards resolving this problem. Bolivia takes paragraph 176 of this decision as a suggestion to resolve this matter, and I quote, maintaining a dialogue and exchange in a spirit of good neighborliness in order to deal with topics involving the access to the Sea of Bolivia. This would require negotiations among the parties, end of quote. Fellow President, processes of integration which are taking place around the world should be based on the effective resolution of the major topics that remain unresolved in Latin America, such as the topic of the sovereignty of the Malvinas Islands, and the fact that Bolivia does not have access to the sea is an unresolved problem which should be solved on the basis of diplomacy and understanding in this new era. In this assembly, we'd like to reiterate our commitment to the principles of the United Nations Charter, the goals established in the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda, and our commitment to eradicate all form of discrimination and racism. Multilateralism is an ideal tool to ensure greater dialogue, cooperation, and the search for solutions to the problems that humankind faces. Will make it possible for us to reestablish the supremacy of international law and preserve social justice and peace, as well as reconfigure a weakened international order. There's no doubt that the challenges to which we confront every day are increasingly more complex. If we want a better future for current and future generations, we must think about the path to take in order to overcome the polarization in the global architecture, and in its place join efforts to promote international cooperation that allows us to confront current problems on a stronger footing. Fellow President and nations of the world, we find ourselves at an unprecedented moment where the future of humankind depends on the decisions that we will make. It is our duty to build a more just and more democratic world based on more solidarity. Let's work to put an end to slow down the climate crisis and to build equality, so that to live well means access to education, healthcare, food, a dignified job, a comprehensive development, and true harmony with Mother Earth. Let's work to ensure the self-determination of peoples and lasting peace. Thank you very much.
We've been watching live the statements of the President of Bolivia, Luis Arce, as part of the high-level debate of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly. President Arce stressed the need for sustainable development that tackles poverty, provides basic public services, ensures respect for human rights and the planet, and is based on solidarity. He underlined the continued injustices and inequalities that divide the nations achieving these goals. He also called for a new model beyond capitalist consumerism and depredation to ensure a good life for the majority of the peoples of the world without destroying the planet in the process. We will of course continue to provide you with all the details as the UN General Assembly continues the session. For teleSUR English, I'm Katrina Goss, and thank you for watching.